As he crossed the snowbound ridge, James picked up the trail of the stag again. The deer was avoiding the heavy snow laid down by the drifts, following the leeward trails where the snow was thin. He'd seen the beast at a range of several hundred yards, too far for a shot, and had to get closer. His father used a crossbow that was good at that range, but James preferred a longbow, relishing the tension of the string beneath his fingers and the subtleties that allowed for greater control and accuracy with each shot. The longbow took more discipline, required more consistency, but gave greater satisfaction. His arrows were good up to a range of 150 yards, but lacked accuracy at that distance, and a wounded animal could bolt for miles, going on for days before succumbing to a clumsy wound. No, unlike the other boys in the nearby village, James wouldn't risk a lazy shot. The thrill of the hunt lay in stalking prey, in outwitting them and positioning them for the best shot, in making a clean kill. And besides, the spill of blood would attract wolves. With a quick kill, he'd have time enough to field dress the beast, carve off its hind flanks and leg muscles before the wolves began to circle. The wolves, though, had learned to leave hunters alone. There was plenty of meat for everyone. No one needed it all, and the wolves understood an easy feed was better than a hard kill, one in which they'd lose at least some of their pack. It was a tacit agreement between species. An easy meal provided safe passage. But like an angry landlord, if the wolves arrived early, before the deer had been carved, they'd demand all they found. Time was of the essence, as the wolves were intelligent. Powdered snow kicked up beneath his snowshoes, spraying lightly in the air with each long shuffle as James worked his way around the peak. He caught a glimpse of the stag below. It had at least 12 points. It was an old male. The meat would be tough but full of flavor. No one would believe him about the size of the horns, and if he hadn't been so stubborn as to hunt alone, he could have had someone else carry them back to gain bragging rights. But it was the meat that was important, not his ego. The stag stopped at the edge of a clearing below. A large tree had fallen and gorged out the snow on the steep slope, clearing away a hillside for several hundred yards and exposing loose shale. The stag could smell something on the breeze. The animal stood proud, its head erect, sniffing at the air. But it wasn't James he was smelling, as he was downwind. James pulled an arrow from his quiver. Its brilliant red flight feathers would provide him with a visual marker, allowing him to track its flight, understand any thermals or wind in the valley below. The stag was roughly 100 yards down the slope. James would have preferred to get closer, but the stag skittered and danced, kicking up powdered snow as it trotted, looking around, smelling danger in the wind. James would have to ensure his first arrow was on target. He'd get time for a second, but not a third. The stag turned away from him, looking down the valley, giving James a clear line of sight at the heart and lungs. From this angle, he could strike in front of the rear leg, up under the stomach, so the arrow could penetrate beneath the ribs and pass through into the animal's chest. The shot would be fatal, but the stag could run for the best part of a mile before dropping. James steadied himself. Kneeling down, he took aim, pulling back on the bowstring with 3 fingers. He kept his wrist tight, in line with his hand so as to keep the tension in his hand to a minimum and allow him to relax into the shot. His father didn't like the 3-fingered hold, preferring a pinch grab, telling him the 3-fingered approach tended to pull to the right on release, but James found it easier to retain pressure while lining up his shot. He breathed deeply, exhaling and relaxing, releasing the bowstring at the bottom of his breath, while his lungs were empty and his body was naturally still. The arrow shot out in a flash, sailing away, arcing through the air, but the deer reacted, jolting with its feet, staggering to one side. It had been spooked by something else, something on the far side of the clearing, further down the hill. James watched as his arrow sailed to within a half a foot of the startled animal as the deer broke to one side, moving for the cover of the trees. Had the deer remained still, James would have struck the massive animal just in front of its hindquarters, right on target. He already had a second arrow up and drawn, ready to fire, but the stag was gone. He could hear the beast bolting through the trees further down the gully. James released the tension on his bow and looked carefully into the shaded forest beyond the clearing. There, on the far side of the gravel and ice, he could see the slow, lumbering outline of a black bear moving through the tree line. He pulled back on his bowstring and took aim. At this distance, an arrow would barely penetrate a bear's thick hide. Although the bear's coat was thick, it would have lost most of its fat during hibernation and hopefully would be in no mood for a prolonged chase. At best, James would simply annoy it, but he was mad. This bear had spoiled his hunt and caused him to lose at least 2 months' worth of cured meats. With the sun moving high in the sky, the day was lost. James aimed for the bear's ass, wanting to give it a good spanking. It was silly, and he knew it. To fire and expose himself was dumb. Although he was safe enough, he figured, as the loose rock would slow down the bear's ascent after him, allowing him to flee. But why inflict a punitive wound? Why exact revenge for his anger? What would it accomplish? Nothing. And so he eased his pull, muttered under his breath before laughing quietly to himself at the absurd notion of even thinking about taking on a bear alone. For its part, the bear sniffed at the breeze. It had picked up the scent of some other game further down the valley. The monstrous animal broke into a gallop which startled James. It bounded off over the hard-packed snow further down the mountain. James picked his way forward beneath the peak. He was foolish to follow a bear, and yet he was curious at what it was chasing. He moved lower down into the valley, away from the snowdrifts on the mountaintop, to where the snow only lay 10 to 15 feet deep. In some places where the trees were thick, sections of ground could be seen, covered in dead branches and pine needles. He avoided those spots as they'd damage his snowshoes. Coming down behind the bear was risky, but he was still downwind and the monster was distracted. Adrenaline pumped through his veins as his mind calculated the risk. James caught sight of the bear making its way slowly down a rough patch of exposed rock, winding around a low cliff face. It had spotted something in the gorge leading into the valley proper. James figured it had to be an easy kill, as the bear wasn't in too much of a rush, and he wondered if the wolves had brought something down and the bear was moving in to scavenge. It was then he saw her, lying in the sun beneath a standing dead pine, lifeless branches littering the ground around her. The snow-covered rocks were stained red with blood. She was clutching at her leg. Even though he couldn't make it out at this distance, James knew what had happened. She had stumbled into a bear trap. But who was she? Why was she out here alone? What was she doing so far from any of the villages of the plain?